Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Podfrak, in the house today. Good friend, good thinker, big brain, David Lancefield. David, a short bio, and then we're going to get into all things in between autonomy, empowerment, transformation, culture, leadership, and everything else we can get into and packed in this 45 minutes or so. So David is the founder of Strategy Shift. He's worked with more than 50 CEOs around the world and hundreds of other C-suite executives to design bold strategies, supercharge their leadership, and transform their culture in 20 countries. Oh my gosh. He's a contributor to Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Review, and Strategy+Business, and as a guest lecturer at the London Business School. He's a former senior partner in strategy or is it ampersand? And as well, longstanding team alumni of PwC. David, great to have you here on the show. We're going to get straight into it. But first, actually, more like a 35,000-foot view introduction into you and your thinking and your brain for listeners and viewers. So a CEO once said to you that you understand, quote, the soul of an organization. I really like that because I feel like I'm a soul guy and we're soul brothers. But I know that in our conversations over the years, you're also fascinated by what makes people tick inside those organizations. So you're a thinker, but you're a feeler. I think you think about how people think, but also how they feel and behave in the organization. So just to open things up, in this day and age, tell me a bit, what is going on in the soul of the organization, given you work with so many different organizations, without naming any, but what's making people tick? What's the soul these days?
Yeah. Hey, I mean, the reason it was a lovely quote and I was quite surprised by it. I'm always happy to be flattered. Um, if you're trying to affect change as a leader, I mean, you have to get into the hearts and minds and soul of a person to affect that change. And tens and hundreds and thousands of people, depending on the size of the organization. Yet a lot of the leadership literature and practice is still very much a top-down, task-based, activity-based, with the assumption that once you say it loudly and clearly enough and repeat it enough, that people will say, oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't realize. Let me just change the way I've been operating for the last 5 years. So the soul of people is, I mean, there are some people who start the day with a sense of optimism, with what can I do? What opportunities can I create? What customers can I delight? There aren't many of them, candidly, in
Mm.
many organizations. There are many people, I think, frankly, who are degree of explicit or implicit anxiety about their life, their role, how they show up, what they're given permission to do. And I think the challenge is leaders often skate over those issues and think they're soft or an HR issue. And actually, people want clarity of direction. They want to be involved and they want to express themselves in a way that's meaningful to them, congruent with their values, and very importantly, this is the hard bit, align with where the organization is going. And often leaders either skate over it, as I said, or go too deep into things and expect people
Mm.
to share everything about their life story. So the trick is knowing how to, explore, discover the best of people.
So in that soul, there's probably a couple things and themes that you've written about, and I wanted to tackle kind of these almost congruently, or at least not in parallel. And that's about sort of empowerment slash autonomy with transformation. And so there's data points everywhere, like in a place where we both get to write, HBR. In 2024, a study there found that companies with high levels of employee empowerment discovered a 21% increase in profit. Asana, same report or a different report, but 23%. So empowerment means a lot, if you will, from a bottom line EBITDA perspective, allegedly. But then if we bring in sort of like one of the more famous management thinkers out there in the world, Peter Drucker, he once said, all organizations say routinely, people are our greatest asset, yet few practice what they preach, let alone truly believing it. So from your perspective, quite frankly, whether it's Drucker or your own or some mashup between the two, what is the deal with employee empowerment and its kind of relationship to transformation, or at least driving some sort of transformation?
I mean, at one level, it's one of the most critical ingredients for transformation because what it's about is trusting people to do their best work, giving them the responsibility to do it, giving some freedom to do it within certain bounds.
Mm.
Yet, empowerment is one of those words that's probably the most overused and misunderstood and mispracticed of all the management terms. I mean, frankly, if you're a leader that has to say the words empowerment, there's probably an issue somewhere already, right?
Right.
And you're
Yeah.
probably not doing it. I mean, I've been in situations without naming names where I've listened to the keynote and so forth about empowerment, and then literally the next day was given the equivalent of instructions on how to be empowered, right? And it was like, I thought I had the choice, right? So there's often a disconnect. But I think it's a critical ingredient, but it's really hard to do well. And it's one of those things that you sort of throw away and think, I empower you. And people are like thinking, what does that actually mean? What decisions can I take?
Hmm.
What trust do I have? Do you believe in me? How do I actually do it? And so they're sort of left hanging at best. And they might, with a good wind, do a reasonable job. But if you're trying to transform an organization, transformation, the whole word is about a substantial shift in the positioning of an organization, its performance, its prospects, and its capabilities. You can't leave empowerment to chance. It has to be a deliberate, skillful act.
And it's that act, however, that it seems we talk a good game in leadership circles and leaders themselves, but with, you might want to call it fundamental attribution error, leaders aren't exactly demonstrating the muscle that is empowerment. It's, to your point earlier, it's perhaps like an HR soft skill thing that waxes lyrical about, but are we actually doing, do we know how to do it? So maybe the segue question is, well, okay, if we know what it is, good, we should do it. But if we're told to do it or we're unsure of how to do it, that's a bigger gap, I would argue, right? So what are you
I
seeing in
agree.
sort of your circles, or how do you help leaders truly develop the muscle of empowerment?
I think the starting point is if you're a person who believes, or at least has read about and seen the research, heard about the power of empowerment, you have to do some work on yourself first.
Mm.
Because unless you're ready for it, you will preach, message, give instructions, and anytime anything goes wrong, or if a decision that's taken that's not quite the decision you expected in your mold, you'll grab onto it and
Mm.
you'll effectively start micromanaging again. And then everyone will hear about it, see it, and then you'll go back to square one. So there's something about, how do you start well as a leader? So there's something around, okay, how do you start well? How do you find the right people? Perhaps it's people you trust. Perhaps it's an activity that's relatively low risk at the beginning. And actually more progressively thinking about what opportunities does it give me? Because if you're empowering people, they should be taking on more responsible. It should leave some space for you to grow and develop. So some people get excited by that. Some people get excited by the fact that they should just frankly get some time back to recover from whatever the exploits they're doing in and what is a very demanding role, especially in transformation. So there's work on yourself. And then there's a sort of series of steps which are critical. One is, what am I empowered to do? Put yourself in the shoes of the empoweree. Just made up that word, but sounds pretty good. The person who's been given the empowerment, right? Okay, what am I empowered to do? What decisions can I actually take and not take? What sort of risk am I allowed to take in doing this? Okay, what happens when it goes wrong? Because at some point it will go wrong.
Mm.
Um, if I am taking decisions or leading a particular activity, where can I go for support and encouragement, mentorship? So you go through these sequences and you realize it's not just a quick email out to somebody, it is a series of stages. And over time, of course, you can sort of take your hands off, but be available to be supported. And a great phrase from a good friend of mine who's a senior executive, he said, when he was having these conversations with people, once he's given that clarity, shown belief in that person, which is
Mm.
critical. I believe you can do it. Actually say it out loud. I believe you can do it. There is something about how you then react in those most difficult moments and how you actually, whether it's something's going wrong or it goes in perhaps a different direction, invoking a mindset of curiosity rather than critique as your sort of default. And I think that sounds very easy to do, but in the heat of the moment, results to deliver under pressure from investors, actually keeping that mindset of curiosity and belief in that person takes real discipline
Mm.
and real resilience.
Yeah, that relationship building piece is going to be quite critical, isn't it? You can't just treat someone like a number in a spreadsheet. Like there, you got to understand their pros and cons, the pluses, the minuses, the how they tick, what makes them tick, what doesn't make them tick. And as a leader, I think ultimately you've got to be there to provide that air cover in the moments in which they do need a leader to support them. Which I think that's exactly what you're saying. I'm fully versed and well versed, sorry,
Mm.
on what you're saying. One of the things before we get to decision making or decentralized decisions or even the decision deficit, which you write so adroitly
Mm.
on, I'm curious if there's a sort of a link between empowerment and autonomy. And where I'm going
Mm.
with this, I suppose, David, is, we both probably read all the same data points, right? So whether it's Gallup's state of the workplace, whether it's McKinsey's, whether it's Deloitte's, DDI's, whatever, but, most recently in 2024, Gallup's State of the Workplace said that was a 35% of employees feel they have autonomy to make decisions. Well, that means 65% don't outright or are quizzical about it. Like it's somewhere in between, 0 to 4 on a Likert, not five. So, you know, if Daniel Ping's drive drove home the point that autonomy is one of these three behaviors that we're supposed to inculcate into ourselves and to our cultures as leaders, that seems again like an irony alert given that book is now pushing 15, 16 years. So we know
Mm.
that autonomy is important, and I think it relates to the decision making thread we're going to get into next. But tell me a bit about your understanding and I guess discovery on empowerment versus autonomy. And then the second follow up there ultimately is, well, if autonomy is also needed, what is it that leaders are doing or not doing between the chasm of empowerment to autonomy?
Yeah. I think both are pretty misunderstood words. And on one hand, they sound very good. But again, I always come back to the recipient. Okay, so
Mm,
autonomy. For some recipients, it will be, okay, I can really do whatever I like, depending on my interests, my career prospects, my causes. And frankly, as long as I'm doing them really well, to the best of my abilities, if they're not coherent or aligned with the organization, that's their problem, whoever they is. So there are some people, and that frankly, that doesn't work. I mean, in the short term, it may work if you're given some time to experiment, you develop your own initiatives. So there is something about autonomy, in terms of the way you think, the way you express yourself, how you manage yourself, during the day, how you show up. And those are, I think, human traits. I think there's a moral code as well in terms of giving people the space to do that. But ultimately, you have to be there to be, I guess, clear on the contribution you're making to your team and organization. If you can't trace a line between what you're doing to the goals of your team and organization, then actually there's a mismatch, which
mm,
in the short term may be okay, but over time that misalignment creates tension, friction, and frankly people thinking, okay, they're pursuing their own goals, and that in this environment, especially with people are feeling anxious under pressure, that's a very difficult space to be in. So autonomy in some ways in terms of mindset expression, the day to day, but ultimately, am I making a positive contribution to the strategy of the organization and to my team? And then, of course, am I given an opportunity to shape it and contribute to it? And those are really practical systemic steps that many leaders skip over, either in the haste to say, "Oh, right, let's have frankly a free for all." Right, I've
mm,
set the picture over here. We've got really bright people. Frankly, you can make it up. Now that's a caricature, but sometimes not that far from the truth. Or they get into a beautiful vision and then they don't spend the time to cascade
mm,
the strategy systematically in the organization because they think, frankly, look, I've been around a long time. I'm very experienced. This stuff is very complex. I want lots of doers, but I don't want too many thinkers because we've set it already. And yes, you've set that level of strategy. You haven't set the levels below it. So for many people, leaders, empowerment and then giving autonomy to people as you go through that continuum is a rewiring of their mindset, and it requires substantially new practices day in, day out. Some people, frankly, can do it, and some people can't. They prefer the preserve of the bureaucracy and the tightness and the micromanagement that, frankly, feels more comfortable to them.
Yeah, that elitism of being a leader, right? Thou shalt follow my lead, not the iterative, communicative, proactive, collaborative, empathic way of leading, which I know you know this, but is so dearly savored by today's employee and team member. They're looking for that camaraderie. Would you agree?
Yes, and hey, presto, some of the people might actually have better ideas about where to take the business, or they may actually call out a challenge, how you're dealing with a customer, how you're working with a partner organization in an ecosystem that you haven't even spotted or heard about, but could be a massive obstacle to progress and growth. So there is something, a mindset, Gary Hamel talks about this, of the arrogance of leadership, which is,
Mhm.
yes, you've got to be really good at certain things, you know, being an architect with the organization, managing really difficult moments, right? Taking difficult decisions. Of course, we know all that. But there's lots of other talent in the organization. Give them the platform, learn from it, and actually use the collective intelligence rather than thinking your own individual intelligence trumps everyone.
Well, it segues nicely to a report I read earlier this year from SHRM, and basically it's just under half of the organization feels, quote, unprepared to make important decisions. And so when you sort of dissect some of the data there, some of that unpreparedness comes from the lack of rapport with the leader, lack of understanding, lack of communication, lack of confidence, which goes back to your point of trust and so on. So you've written eloquently about in the past the decision deficit and that kind of gap between empowerment and transformation ultimately that can be a result of what decision deficits create. So I'm curious, in your mind, and writing in head, what is the decision deficit? And then, secondly, after explaining that, I'm curious to know if you think that there are strategies or tactics that leaders might be thinking about to help the team member and themselves, quite frankly, become more confident, specifically with that gap, but ultimately with that relationship on the transformation. Decisions have to be made. We've kind of tiptoed around empowerment and autonomy. There's this whole thing has got to be related somehow in my mind. So, how about her, Mr.
Absolutely.
Lansfield?
Well, I mean, empowerment, I mean, one of the critical elements of empowerment is the giving of decision-making authority. So that there's a link there. At least
Yeah.
that's one part of it. The deficit is around, on the one hand, the greater need for effective decision-making throughout the organization, but the gap being either the willingness, confidence, and capability of people to do it. So on the one hand, you need it, but actually, when you throw it over the fence, people are like, "Oh, don't want to do
Yeah.
it. Too anxious, too scared, don't know how to do it," and so forth. So, I mean, a number of things come up on decisions. And I was running a masterclass recently on big meetings, and I asked a simple question of when you're in meetings, for example, whatever shape or form, but some of the more important meetings, how clear are you about decisions? And oftentimes people talk about topics and issues and agendas and so on that. And you say, okay, so what decision do we want to make together today? And often it's missing, or it's assumed, or it's taken out of the room or Zoom. So one of the critical steps is naming the decision that either you are going to make or you're going to empower somebody to make. Actually
Mm.
say it out loud. The decisions that you can take are the following. Ah, right. Okay. Just to be clear, somebody else, this person will be taking other decisions. That sounds super simple, but actually requires real clarity of thought about roles, responsibilities, and how that maps to the business and where the value and risk is. But firstly, just name it, right? The other big bucket of sort of if tasks would be building the capability of people to actually make decisions. Many
Mm.
people who have grown up in organizations, frankly, having decisions made for them.
Mhm.
And of course, micro decisions they're making every day. Where do I spend my time? How do I show up in a particular way? And I don't mean those decisions,
Yeah.
but if you're running a team, running a profit and loss, running a division, whatever it is, or a function, actually your decision making muscle is probably atrophied or probably hasn't been there. So there is something about how do you teach people how to make decisions? Now, you can go through and talk about a framework. here's the decision, here's the criteria, here's the options and rank and go through that process. That's quite an analytical head sort of process. And that's necessary, especially for some organizations that actually require a systematic process and evidence that's used in that process. I think the other thing is when, as a leader looking to empower people, you have to actually talk about how you are making decisions, talk about it out loud. So often decisions are imposed on people if they are actually said. So here's a decision. The decision is X. Great, thank you. And you sort of think, okay, I have clarity on the decision. How did they get there? How did they use this discussion to get there? You can probably work it out, but you might have 5 versions of the truth from that conversation. So there is something about having the discipline and the courage, especially if it's a delicate topic, for a leader to say, this is how I came to this decision. Now, it doesn't mean the other person has to follow exactly their logic or their balance of qualitative or quantitative information, intuition, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it means that you're learning from somebody and think, actually, I understand the framework. I understand what the decision is. I've been hearing, sensing, observing how somebody's thinking through these decisions. Actually, I feel more able and capable. Let me have a go.
So then what's getting in the way, I suppose, right, of this type of decision making? Is it any of the above? Is it hubris on the leader's behalf? Is it busyness? Is it not having decision kind of trees or decision making models and engagement levels, like understanding the processes, basically? Like what are some of the impediments and hurdles that you're seeing in some of the work that you're doing, David?
Well, all of the above. I guess I'd add two. I think in some organization, there's a premium for doing rather than thinking.
Yeah.
So there's either an established process or unwritten rules. And actually, it's about putting the hours in, putting the shifts in, showing grit, determination, and so forth. And then making explicit the decisions that underpin that actually is, well, in doing that, what I'm going to give some of my power away from the doing and being responsible to somebody else. So there's something around, okay, you're trying to move from a mindset of inputs and effort driving influence to one where, of course, that's still important, but actually if you move to one which is more about outcomes, then actually you think, so I want the best minds making the most complex decisions because I care about that outcomes. If that means in this conversation, I'm the curator bringing people together, I'm the catalyst to ask the right questions, I'm clear on my role and I'm clear on the outcomes, actually I will invite others to contribute to the decision or make their own decisions. If, however, you think your life and your performance and the performance of the organization is based on many people in their particular boxes marching forward, working really, really hard, you ain't going to give up control easily, if
Right.
at all. And the challenge, of course, is you're walking towards some form of disruption or disaster at some point. You just don't know when.
Mm-hmm. Well, this all segues quite nicely, I shall say, to something I wanted to do with you in particular. So, David, I've not done this before on Leadership Now, but I figured, you know what? Here's the cat to try this out with in the sandbox. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a piece of research that came out in April of this year. I'm going to give you sort of the 3-prong highlights to it. And I want to get your advice, take, and sort of thoughts on it. It has specifically, because we're segueing to effectively the next part of our discussion around decentralized versus centralized decision making, and how perhaps both is required, but how do you kind of create that culture, and what's the systems and the processes, all the things we've kind of led ourselves to. So doctors Hendrik Hutterman, Stefan Berger, Max Reinwald, and Heike Broek released a paper this year. It was called Power to the People and Then, and the subtitle is A Multi-Level Leadership Perspective on Organizational Decentralization. So here's what they did. 5,807 individuals were interviewed. 144 companies were involved across Europe. And they basically were looking at this notion of centralized versus decentralized. So here's the big 3 takeaways and then I'll ask you a question. So number one, none of these are probably surprise to you, by the way, because of the work that you do. So number one, transferring decision-making authority to lower organizational levels can enhance employees' emergent leadership, and it's significantly influenced by the empowering leadership of their direct supervisors. So in sum, empowering leaders who support and guide their employees effectively make the decentralized structure more beneficial. Number two, employees who take on informal leadership roles due to that increased autonomy and support from their direct leader contribute to better overall organizational outcomes through their own higher motivation, which then comes back to probably empowerment, and thus better decision making and improved information flow occurs. Number three, the researchers also argue that leaders play a critical role in realizing the strategic benefits of decentralized decision-making structures. Their ability, quote, to empower and provide clarity to employees determines whether the potential of decentralization is actually fully utilized so that the organization improves its performance. So, kind of nicely dovetails, as I mentioned, right, to our discussion thus far through the first half an hour or so. Yeah. So, ta-da! So this question I want to really ask you about the research is sort of a level up from it. How do leaders in your work strike the balance between centralized and decentralized, between the delegation, the empowerment, the autonomy, and the strategic transformation that ultimately a lot of these organizations are trying to deal with?
So I think the research there I fully agree with. I think the challenge is that is increasing the number of people who want to and are able to take on the roles that have the benefits you just described. Because I think the vast majority are not ready, not able, not confident enough, not capable enough. So that's the gap. I'm not being I'm not being a negatron. I like to be a positron. I mean, in terms of the centralization, decentralization, look, if you're designing a transformation of an organization, which candidly for most is a catch-up story, it's taking an incumbent traditional organization and catching up to the modern world and in terms of the expectations of customers. And it's a multi-year, sometimes multi-decade experience. There are big picture questions and decisions that the board, the executive committee should be taking, the overall strategic direction of the organization and so forth. Now, the way they do that should be more open than it has been, hence the interest in open strategy and open innovation in a way that people can share throughout the organization and outside, importantly, their own views on the opportunities and challenges. But ultimately, the decisions still need to be taken about, using Roger Martin's sort of framing, where do we focus? How do we win? What do we do best? And so forth. Those are big picture organizational or enterprise-wide decisions. When you then want to cascade it down into, depending on the structure of the organization, a geography basis or a business unit or a function, then the question is, there's a conversation between the executive sponsor and the individual teams around, okay, this is the bigger picture that you've been shaping. You know your business division function geography better than anyone, or you should do, right? This is the space. This is the space to play with, if you like. And of course, there'll be a dialogue in terms of, does it fit? Is there coherence? But ultimately, if they believe in that empowerment model, you then start cascading it through, and it goes further throughout the organization. The challenge is that it requires really high quality conversations, right? Proper listening, all the soft stuff that we think is really soft and it's really hard to do. Really proper listening, the psychological safety where people can call out either real issues that are under the carpet or actually not in somebody's purview. And at the same time, it requires a forensic investigatory mind where people can really drill into okay, this is the detail I really need to master in order to deliver in my particular unit, all the way down to the small team. They have to be very forensic to say, oh, okay, let's look at that, tracing that line. Does it all work? And so big picture design questions, and of course, decisions in the moment around commercials, operational crises as they happen, top team. But ultimately, they are effectively a portfolio manager, catalyst role, architect role, and beacon of the behaviors they expect in the organization for the others who then if you like, cascade up to that bigger picture. That's
Hmm.
how I see the balance between centralization and more decentralization.
Well, you brought up Roger's work, and in Playing to Win, his sort of fifth of five questions to ask ultimately is what are the management processes and organizational paradigm changes that we need to make in order to affect the strategy? So, do you see decision making principles at centralized, decentralized level as one? And if so, or just what's your take on the decision making guidelines that an organization needs to be thinking about, if not just leaders in their own unit or team?
So I'm a big believer in sort of principles rather than rules, although there will
Yeah.
be certain activities that are very high risk or sensitive where you may just frankly need to give pretty prescriptive rules. But my view is if you set the right conditions, people can be given principles, and then there's ongoing review of how these decisions are playing out, and you iterate as you go through. I think the challenge and often the obstacles in that fifth box, which whether it's in five or in six, which is around systems and the culture of the organization, which is how work gets done in simple terms, is it's often the micro behaviors that actually either enable or obstruct of the ultimate transformation. I'll give you one practical example. So somebody's been given this, been empowered with a particular role, given a certain degree of autonomy to do it, clear on the decisions and so forth. Yet they look at their incentive structure, whatever type of organization they're in, and they think, hang on. So I'm going in this direction here, but actually my incentive structure is still what I've been having for the last 5 years, been playing with the last 5 years. And it doesn't, why should I believe in that picture? But effectively, I'm not being assessed and assessed in the same way, which is a very practical thing. I remember in one particular joint venture I was working on, we picked it up in the end, but frankly, a little bit too late, where we are talking about a very genuinely disruptive strategy, which would take many years, put quite a lot of capital at risk. And everyone around the table, they were being assessed on effectively month by month or quarter by quarter KPIs,
Hmm.
right? And so they were, on the one hand, talking a good game. On the other hand, so just about ready to make a decision. But then actually, the inner voice would be, hang on. I'm not sure in the next 6 months we're going to make those KPIs. So I'm basically going to shoot myself in the foot in order for a bigger game that I hope at some point I'm going to be applauded for and rewarded by.
Right.
That's a big leap. So it's often the micro instruments, if you like, and the micro behaviors you really have to get into. And that's something I'm particularly passionate about. The big picture, the strategy, the context in which you're operating in, and then really drilling down into what's the mindset shifts? What are the behavioral shifts? What are the systemic shifts you have to make to encourage people to do, to play in that space?
So
That's the
then,
really tricky stuff.
well, maybe, I don't know if it's penultimate, if not second to last question, but then I would suggest to you that perhaps leader self awareness needs to be almost at the top of the pile of things for them to be thinking about. Because back to hubris and overconfidence or head in sand syndrome, like you've got sort of pick your poison, right? You've got some unaware leaders out there, and God knows how they got to these roles, to be honest, David. But there's something there that has to happen. And so, how do we break the curse of leaders being or lacking, I should say, the self awareness to do what you're suggesting? Oh yeah, I'll stop there. What do you think?
So I mean, getting super practical for a moment. If they thought about literally their next day, and they looked at their schedule of whether it's one-to-one or bigger meetings, and they asked themselves two questions. One is, how many questions am I going to ask in these interactions? And it may be from, oh yes, of course I ask questions, but then the other voice says, actually, I hardly ask any questions at all. Your first prompt may be, okay, I'm going to ask 3 or 4 good questions. That would be a shift, not only in terms of actually getting some insight, but also signaling to people that they're more open to think in
Mm.
new ways. And there may be some aha moment that comes from that. Sometimes not. The second shift in terms of self-awareness is actually saying, okay, what's the balance between my internal and external lens? And many leaders, again, will casually drop in a particular statistic or a customer conversation. But the reality is, 90 to 95% of their real focus is inside the organization, and it's too dominant.
Mm.
So if you want to increase your self-awareness, it's invite people to share what they think, and get outside more. And it's not just outside the building, to use Steve Blank's sort of term, but it's the edges of the organization, the voices that are perhaps not being heard, the more radical thinkers, the newcomers to the organization, not just the people you feel comfortable with, or the people you've sort of grown up with, or the people you sort of, have a shared, I don't know, background with. Actually consciously, look out for people where you actually don't know what they think, before you've asked them the question. And if you start creating that stimuli, you might actually tell you something new. And all of these things are micro changes. They're nudges, they're shifts that you can make literally the next day. They're not suddenly, I need to go on a retreat for 5 weeks and find myself and so forth. I mean, some people do that, nothing wrong with it. But actually, for many people, that's too difficult, scary, or not their thing. Okay, what are the marginal shifts you can make in what you ask, where you spend your time, and who you listen to?
It's quite profound, David. Before I ask more about you, a selfish question for me in the throes of navigating a new book. I want to ask you a question related to what we've talked about today with older workers. So where do you think older workers, and what I mean by older, you can pick your age bracket, but they're not young. Where do you think older workers can help play a part in some of our discussion today for young people to learn some of these skills and traits that we have discussed?
I think for a start, they have to be in the organization. And often, frankly, it's just too hard to work. I mean, just practically, if you're 60 plus working in an organization, just the barriers are up in contractual legal terms as well as mindset. So they have to be in the building, right? Or in the organization. I guess more substantively, there's the obvious thing around they've been around for a while, they've had experience. That's pretty obvious. I think, however, the more interesting thing is I think they are probably less encumbered either by the history of the organization or just perhaps their confidence they have to where they are. And they'll probably say what they think, see, and sense more actively. Whereas other people, and it doesn't mean they're going to shoot their mouth off, but they probably think, what have I got to lose? And actually, perhaps I've got something that might be worth listening to. So I think there's something around, they probably listen. Some people will listen more, and some will call out the things that, the elephants in the room, the undiscussables. But also they may come, if you select them carefully and wisely, they may come from a very different angle. So I think they have a massive potential. And it's one of those aspects of the business world that is, you have so many organizations, companies and consultancies saying, we believe in the power of and the prospects of the aging population. They're very important in terms of customer base. They're very important as employees. And then you look at it practically and say, okay, so are they there? Do you listen to them? Do you engage with them? And you say, well, it's a bit hard, isn't it? Because, and you think, oh. So you think they have value and potential. How easy do you make it for them to contribute? Start there.
Love it. Thank you for that. You are David Lancefield. You're the founder of Strategy Shift. Where can we find out more about you?
That's very kind, Dan. Very kind. So I'm active on LinkedIn. I like to post, share, comment. Strategyshift.co.uk is the platform, the business I create, and my own more personal works are on davidlancefield.com. And I hope to try and be responsive, and I love learning from people.
Well, I get to learn a lot from you. I'm so glad that our paths crossed several years ago. But I did want to thank you not just for this, but for your contributions. I mean, whether it's at HBR, obviously, or MIT Sloan Review, Strategy+Biz, like you're just a renowned writer. But I really appreciate your thinking. And you're making things simpler for people to see, and the connection of the dots between what is and what can be, but also with those pragmatic and practical techniques and tactics and solutions to help us cross that chasm. So for that, I thank you, Mr. Lancefield.
That's very kind. I appreciate your kind words, Dan. Thank you.
Well, a good time today. I hope you had one as well. For the folks watching or listening, of course, David Lancefield, please check him out on all facets that he alluded to. In the show notes will be those links as well, and a couple of his latest articles in the aforementioned pieces of press. This was another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. David Lancefield in the house. Thanks again, David.